Buenos días, buenos días. Me llamo Yomaira Figueroa Vázquez, and every time I get in this microphone, I don't know what language to speak. ¿Viste? Every time. My name is Yomaira Figueroa Vázquez, and I'm the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, CENTRO. Thank you for being with us today here as we celebrate the research and arts that sought to examine multiple entry points to the study of archival study and archives in the context of Puerto Rico and its diasporic histories. This is our inaugural symposium celebrating our theme for the year. Last year, our vision was to create thematic years for Centro for the next 5 years. This year, the theme Archives, Memory, and the Present Past of Puerto Rico was meant to be a year-long study of research and artistic engagement with questions such as, what is the state of Puerto Rican archives, archival theory, and archival practices? What are the roots of Puerto Rican studies, and how can we best tend to its past and futures? With the support of the Mellon Foundation, which awarded us a historic, for Centro, $6.48 million grant to bring this vision to fruition, yes, we were able to offer fellowships to a broad range of scholars in the field of Puerto Rican studies, bringing these beautiful folks together across geographies and across time zones each week to break bread and to delve into their respective disciplines, methods, and praxis. I want to thank the fellows for joining us this year: Emma Amador, Daniel Morales Armstrong, Keishla Rivera Lopez, Cristina Perez Jimenez, Amanda Guzman, Senia Rubinos, Joaquin Villanueva, Shakti Castro, Alberto Ortiz Diaz, Lorraine Torres Colon, Carrie-Ann Soto Vega, and Neida Collazo Llorens. Thank you. Thank you. I would also like to thank our faculty presider for this inaugural year, Vanessa Perez Rosario. Thank you so much. With this, we really wanted to also not just offer opportunities for our colleagues and our peers that are in other institutions, but also within CUNY itself. So bringing a faculty presider from within CUNY is really important to keep that kind of like vigorous connection and attention to the study of our fields. Our grant manager and director of research programs, Issei Diaz. Oh, there you are. And Cristel Justino Diaz. Hey. They have been critical to the success of our pilot cohort. Thank you so much. And the teams of Centro that have been connected, and all teams of Centro are connected to this work. We all work together collaboratively to bring this together, but I really want to thank the events team. Thank you so much, events. I want to thank the communications team for, just being so supportive in this practice. The media team that is always representing. Thank you, media. As well as our library and archives team. Thank you so much. You have been truly incredible in ensuring the success of everything that we do and the success of this year's theme. I have said this many times, and I'm going to continue to say it. I'm so honored to work in a place where the over 80 staff members of Centro are so deeply committed to Puerto Rican studies, to Puerto Rican people, and to our multiple publics. It blows my mind all the time, because even though everything is not easy every day here, what I realize is people deeply continue to stay rooted in the place because they care about the mission of why this place was built. We are in an exciting time in Puerto Rican studies, but sustaining this renaissance in Puerto Rican studies and rooting ourselves deeply in our culture, our practices, and our thought is still difficult, especially amid the fascist political climate. However, we know that Puerto Rican studies is more than just a trend or a thought experiment. Puerto Rican studies and Centro are the result of students, community members, and faculty continually battling to bring the histories and struggles of people to the fore of movements for justice and self-determination. The students who fought for the creation of fields like Puerto Rican studies and other fields of ethnic studies and gender studies in the 1960s and the 1970s, as well as generations of students since, have recognized that it was not them or their families or their communities or even their ancestors who lacked value, the capacity for humanity and generosity. Instead, it was the violence of Western society, born and sustained through coloniality, that was the decadent and dying civilization, and therefore ill-equipped to solve the problems of its own creation, as Aimé Césaire so eloquently has told us in Discourse on Colonialism. An essay, I think, published in the late 40s, early 50s, maybe 1952 when it came to print, and it still remains ever pressing and prescient now. As a first generation, working poor Afro-Puerto Rican student and budding scholar, I knew that the road ahead would be difficult. I carried with me the stories of my family, their journeys, their struggles, their joy, their courage into every classroom that I walked into. In many ways, Puerto Rican studies saved my life, and it gave texture and meaning to what had until then been solely defined as pathos. It inspired a thirst for knowledge and cultivated a sense of duty. ¿Cuál es tu compromiso con Puerto Rico? ¿Cuál es tu compromiso con los estudios puertorriqueños? ¿Cuál es tu compromiso con el centro that was founded to support those two things? If we are meant to survive this political moment and the ones that are to come, it is by traversing the snares of empire together. If you're here today, it's because we were meant to find each other here, putting our sustaining attention on the powerful work of the scholars who are going to present today. Puerto Rican Studies is a lifeline, an insurgent emancipatory project, a mode of survival in the fullest sense, and a necessary practice that, should it be taken seriously within the self-proclaimed hallowed halls of educational institutions and their innumerable administrators and leaders, would lead to a transformation of knowledge itself and enable liberatory political and social projects to be undertaken in earnest with the seriousness that they deserve. And that's what we're doing here today, putting our sustained attention on this work and thinking through what liberation politics means for us now, what it meant for our people in the past, and what it can mean for us in the future. Thank you so much.
Welcome to our first panel, Expanding Archival Methodologies. I am Vanessa Perez Rosario. I'm a professor here at CUNY. I teach at Queens College and the Graduate Center, and I've had the enormous pleasure of working with the inaugural group of Rooted and Relational Fellows this year, as well as the leadership team and the staff at CENTRO. I want to thank Dr. Jomaira Figueroa Vasquez for her incredible vision for Puerto Rican Studies and for this institution, and for our fields. And I want to thank Ise, Diaz, Cristel, Jusino for all of their work this semester, and also all of the staff who've been amazing in bringing it. Here you are, Karina, everyone at CENTRO that has just made this this fellowship year. I've not been on fellowship, but it's still been amazing to be able to share with the fellows and be part of this group. So I'm very grateful. I believe this. I've said it many times. I believe this research initiative will be transformative to the field of Puerto Rican Studies. I keep saying that in our group, in our weekly meetings. And you will have a sense of that. Those of you who are here and who in the future watch these videos, you'll have a sense of that when you hear the fellows share their work today. I could say a lot more, but I think the evidence of that is going to be here on display. So, and I know that you want to hear from the fellows, so we'll move quickly to their work. I'll offer very brief bios of the fellows. Their full bios are on the Rooted and Relational website. So instead of using the time of the panel for that, I will point you to that. You can read more about these amazing scholars on the CENTRO website. So very brief, and then that will be followed by presentations with time for Q&A at the end. So our first panelist is Daniel Morales Armstrong. He is sitting right here to my left. He's an educator and historian of Puerto Rican slavery and emancipation. I think we'll go in the order that we're seated here. So Cristina Perez Jimenez is an associate professor of English at Manhattan College, specializing in U.S. Latinx and Caribbean studies. Amanda Guzman is an assistant professor in anthropology and the co-director of the Center for Caribbean Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And Joaquin Villanueva is a critical human geographer and a professor at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. So should we just, are the presentations lined up in this order? Okay, perfect. So the structure of the panel today is that each fellow will present for approximately 10 minutes. I think Karina's going to help us keep time. And after these brief presentations, we'll have about 30 minutes for discussion and Q&A.
As mentioned, I'm a historian of Puerto Rican slavery and abolition, and today I'll be talking about some reflections about combating the dehumanization of Black people in the Puerto Rican archives of slavery. Now, what are the archives of Puerto Rican slavery? It's the body of documents, collections, and artifacts born out of and about the institution of slavery in Puerto Rico, right, which lasted from the early 1500s through the 1870s, as well as about the people whose lives it shaped. And this includes enslaved people and those who benefited from their labor, including but not limited to their enslavers. All right? And these documents include correspondence, reports, plantation logs, church records, censuses, etc., more than I can list today. Now, by and large, the documents in the archives of Puerto Rican slavery were written by people who believed in, accepted, or worked to maintain the architecture of slavery. And as a result, their beliefs that Black people were things as opposed to people that could be bought and sold, that they lacked interiority, right, shaped the documents. Those biases brought the everyday violence of slavery into the written record in explicit and implicit ways. They created silences about the lives of enslaved people and leave historians today with more questions than answers. And without sufficient interrogation of those sources, historians can easily reproduce those dehumanizing tropes and the violent representations of Black people that we find in the archives. Even in an era that significantly expanded Puerto Rican slavery studies, veteran scholar of the field Francisco Scarano notes that much of it focused on the institution of slavery as opposed to the enslaved people, which effectively pushes them to the periphery of their own stories. In the light of the limitations of the archives of Puerto Rican slavery, my commitments are to focus unapologetically on Black people who were subjected to slavery in Puerto Rico and to honor the fullness of their personhood. This means I use the archive against its very nature to recognize the texture of their everyday lives beyond the condition of enslavement. And in that vein, I want to introduce you to some of the people I have met through the archives of Puerto Rican slavery. Rosalia Canales was born in 1790 somewhere on the African continent. She was trafficked to the Caribbean, where she was then enslaved on the Hacienda Julita in Dorado, Puerto Rico. The hacienda was owned by the Scarret family, the Scarret brothers. And there she labored as a cook on the sugar estates for the sugar estates enslaved population. In the early 1870s, when Rosalia was just entering her 80s, the documents show that she repeatedly pushed against the bounds of her enslavement. For example, she was caught selling food rations to free Black people who lived near the plantation. Over 6 years leading up to her being caught doing this, her clandestine money-making enterprise earned her more than 500 pesos, right? This was a small fortune at the time, which at different points during the 1800s could have been enough to purchase her freedom. After she was punished for selling the plantation's resources for personal gain, she set fire to a set of wagons that were used to transport cut sugar cane to be processed. The following year, this is retaliation, right? The following year, perhaps after she had earned more money, she demanded that she be granted her freedom under what were described as disrespectful terms, for which she was once again punished. Perhaps she sought to use the 500 pesos to negotiate freedom for her and her children as well, or made the case that she had already paid for her freedom over her decades of unpaid labor. The next day, a small house near the kitchen where she worked was burned to the ground. And this was the last straw for the Scarret brothers, who said, okay, we're going to grant you your freedom on one condition, and that condition is that you leave the hacienda and the area and that you never come back. In the coming weeks, the mayor of Dorado added a condition to her manumission after the fact, that her son, Rufino Canales, be transferred to Cuba because the pair of them, in his opinion, were so bad an influence on the enslaved people in the area that it wasn't enough for her to leave. Rufino also had to go. Rufino was described in the documents as negative, arrogant, incorrigible, and rebellious. qualities that Scarrett had also used to describe his mother. But what do these terms mean in the context of slavery? These records show that they were used to villainize the mother and son's efforts to exercise agency over their experiences under slavery, from earning money for their labor and demanding freedom, as Rosalia did, to fleeing the plantation and stealing its resources, as Rufino had done, as shown elsewhere in the documents. Well, Rosalia, who had moved to San Juan at this point, caught wind of the push to exile her son. She brought legal representation to the government to revoke that condition, risking being re-enslaved in order to keep her son from being sent to the larger sugar-producing colony. At this point, Rosalia is in her 80s, right? So him being shipped to Cuba while still enslaved meant that she effectively would never see him again, right? It might have been cost prohibitive and also difficult for her to get on a ship and go to Cuba. And then after being enslaved in Cuba, he could have been sent anywhere. Ultimately, however, the government allowed for Rosalia to maintain her freedom and block Rufino's transfer to Cuba. Other records show that Rosalia lived another 18 years until she was 99 in the very same municipality that she had agreed to leave for good. And she lived there in community with Rufino, 2 of her other daughters, and a handful of grandchildren. She also got married after she got her freedom, which is an interesting thing. The red star here on the map is the area where the hacienda was located. And the yellow star is the barrio where Rosalia lived and died in freedom. In fact, her death certificate shows that Rufino was the one who reported her passing. And the document shows that she died of old age. Now, if we are to think about enslaved people, as I think we should, as more than the imposed condition of their enslavement, we have to make space to seriously consider the other facets of their lives that existed concurrently and in spite of that condition, such as their interpersonal relationships. In that vein, the documents do not explicitly say it, because they're written by the Scarrett brothers and the mayor of Dorado, but they show us that for Rosalia, family and being close to them was important. So much so that she was willing to forfeit her freedom to keep her son from being exiled to Cuba. The condition of her enslavement did not preclude Rosalia from deeply loving and caring for her children. The pain of potentially never seeing her son again had the weight to make her act in what can be seen as a drastic way. But as a parent myself, and I imagine that others can relate to this, many of us know the feeling of seeing our children in pain or at risk of being hurt and wishing to take that hurt on for ourselves so that they won't feel it. I imagine that that's what Rosalia felt in this moment too. And this is why, in light of the limitations of the archives of slavery, we need to be looking at and for the relationships enslaved and newly freed people had beyond those they had with their enslavers. These relationships, which are documented in fragments, in censuses, death certificates, baptismal records, other church records, etc., can provide us with a greater understanding of their lived experiences, and sometimes, as in Rosalia's case, their motivations. I want to end with a quick visualization exercise that I do with my students. I want you to think of this when you read or hear about an enslaved person's story, so it can be a reminder that they were more human than they were enslaved. I invite you for this visualization exercise to close your eyes. Imagine a mosquito is buzzing in your ear. You're reading a book, or trying to sleep, or standing in the afternoon sun. Maybe it's bitten you already. How would you feel about the mosquito circling your body, floating suddenly into your consciousness to capture your attention, about the lingering itch after its bite? What do you do? At some point, you would likely try to swat the mosquito away, or if it's already landed on you, you might try to flick it off. Now imagine that both you and this mosquito exist in a time and place much different than you live in now, 19th century Puerto Rico. Would your feelings about the mosquito be much different? Unlikely. A mosquito is an unpleasant companion regardless of place, time of day, the language you speak, and the era you live in. And despite the totality with which racial slavery touched and sought to shape the lives of Black people in Puerto Rico, I imagine that they too would have had similar feelings about a mosquito keeping them from sleeping or breaking their concentration while performing dangerous and potentially disabling labor or causing their ankle to itch. If we can imagine them swatting a mosquito from their ear or the respite from the hot Caribbean sun they found under a passing cloud. It's much easier to imagine them having other human experiences we know well. From the awe of looking out over the Caribbean Sea or being soothed by the coquille's lullaby, phenomena of the natural world, to interpersonal experiences, the excitement of falling in love, or finally spending a moment with someone you trust after a long day, the anxiety about separating from your family that Rosalia might have experienced, or the grief of losing a parent who went above and beyond for you, as Rufino likely felt for his mother. Those possibilities beg for us to acknowledge, more broadly, that despite the conditions imposed on Black bondspeople, each of them was a universe unto themselves, with thoughts and feelings as numerous as the stars they contain. The Black people in the archives of Puerto Rican slavery were just as complex back then as you and I are today. To believe that they were not is to echo the archive of slavery, and part of how we've been taught to think about enslaved people as less than human, as having limited interiority, as not being creative or brilliant or cariñoso or whatever other qualities exist in any community today. Once we recognize the wholeness of their being in ways we can and can't know, asking who they were, what they thought about their restricted freedom, and how they might have refused its power over them is hardly a stretch. It's an obligation. Thank you.
So I just wanna echo what Danielle just said. This year has been very rewarding intellectually, and it was just a privilege to be in community with all my fellows and people in CENTRO. It's been really a highlight thus far in my career. So when I first began this research project on Puerto Rico's mid-20th century urban and economic development programs, I was obsessed with finding the exact location of some of the communities that fell victim to the modernization of Puerto Rico in the 1950s. I went to my institution's map library and pulled a collection of San Juan maps from the 1960s to the present, frustrated with my inability to locate El Fanguito in those pictorial representations of Puerto Rico's capital. I searched digital platforms such as Google Maps for traces of El Fanguito and its spatial extent, but to no avail. It was at this moment that I realized that I was searching for a phantom place. Subsequently, I decided to study how, why, and who had ghosted El Fanguito from the landscape and memory. I was curious to learn who in Puerto Rico had amassed sufficient power to be able to disappear an entire community of humans from the landscape and the historical record. As you can see in this map, there's no trace of it. It will be located where you see at the bottom there. It says Parque Central of San Juan. That will be more or less where it used to be. In this paper, I will address some of the ways in which El Fanguito, an informal settlement in mid-20th century San Juan, was ghosted from the landscape and the archives. In addition, this presentation also intends to explore how El Fanguito and its residents continue to hunt the landscape and the archives. These two processes, ghosting and hunting, I argue, are central to racial capitalist urbanization, which, as we all know, is premised on dispossession and displacement as the basis of urban development. Rather than document the full scale of the urban violence that produces ghosts under capitalism, I want instead to focus on hunting as a methodological technique to read silences in the archives. To help me articulate the argument, I introduced the concept of phantom places, places purposely invoked to hunt the spatial erasures and archival silences that continuously ghost them from the landscape and history. In my work, I invoke the ghost of El Fanguito in order to trouble the dominant archives of the Puerto Rican nation and the myths that those archives produce and reproduce. I follow the work of Dominican scholars Lorgia Garcia Peña and Dixa Ramirez to consider the formation and consolidation of official archives in Caribbean colonial societies. Garcia Peña, for instance, theorized what she called the Archive of Dominicanidad. Those historical documents literary texts, monuments, and cultural representations sustaining national ideology. Those dominant archives were collected, stored, organized, and interpreted by the Criollo elite who mobilized archival materials to construct national myths and draw the racial borders of the nation. I trace a similar genealogy in Puerto Rico by paying attention to what historian Llorel Meléndez Vadillo called the Archive of Puerto Ricanidad, the official archives of the Puerto Rican nation, documents and artifacts collected, stored, and organized to tell a narrow history of Puerto Rico and its colonial elites. As historian Ileana Rodriguez Silva and anthropologist Isaac Godreau have shown, integral to the construction of the Archive of Puerto Ricanidad is the silencing of race to sustain the myth of mestizaje. In other words, the Archive of Puerto Ricanidad is full of ghosts, spectral traces that, despite their erasures and lack of documentation, are there waiting to haunt the Archivo de la Puerto Ricanidad. In thinking about ghosts and their capacity to haunt the present, I also engaged with the work of geographer Andrea Ray Roberts, who reflected on hunting as agency, as a particular political and methodological intervention that troubles our contemporary landscapes. Hunting produces a cultural space to begin to think about how our surrounding geographies could be if the ghosts of the dispossessed were still with us in bodily rather than spectral form. For my research, I fully immersed myself in the Rafael Pico collection at the University of Puerto Rico, where his personal papers are located. In 1942, the last U.S. American governor of Puerto Rico, Rexford G. Tugwell, appointed Rafael Pico as the first president of the Puerto Rico Planning Board. Pico was a young doctorate in geography from Clark University that was at the time teaching geography to college students at the UPR. For 12 years, Pico chaired the planning board, shaping the agency's vision, agenda, and priorities in fundamental ways. One of the first orders of business of the planning board in the 1940s was the slum clearance program, whose objective was to identify, map, and devise strategies to clear the slums proliferating across San Juan's urban landscape. Rafael Pico left us with a very rich archive. He was a hoarder, collecting almost everything on his path. He had a very successful career that spanned many decades of travel, public engagements, and important decisions that shaped the current trajectory of Puerto Rico. Traces of his travels and relationship with a very wide network of individuals can be clearly seen in his personal papers. As the main architect in the erasure of El Fanguito from the landscape in the mid-1950s, however, I saw no trace of the existence of El Fanguito or its residents in the collection. Pico, it turned out, had produced many ghosts. I decided to invoke the phantom place of El Fanguito to always keep that place present in all my readings of Rafael Pico's archive. El Fanguito, it must be clearly stated, was seen by these colonial and Criollo officials as a black space, a black neighborhood that worked as a barrier to the flow of U.S. industrial capital that they so much desired. If race in Puerto Rico is that which defines who we are, while at the same time that which we cannot be spoken about, if the myth of mestizaje defines us as the sons and daughters of three races, Spanish, indigenous, and African, that because of their mixture cannot therefore harbor any form of racism, if that myth not only silences blackness and indigeneity, but privileges whiteness, if that myth is always present but rarely directly referenced in the archive of Puerto Ricanidad, how can then invoking the phantom place of El Fanguito trouble that national ideology? I wanted to hunt Pico's papers with the black geographies of El Fanguito. What then did this methodological intervention allow me to access? The hunting of Pico's paper allowed me to render visible his whiteness and the violence he embodied. At various times, I stumbled upon basic demographic information about Pico, which otherwise would have been helpful to at least provide a brief biographic sketch of this character. However, when read against the ghost of El Fanguito, I was able to read these documents in a new light. When asked about his race, Picot consistently self-identified as white. That is not to be taken lightly, because that meant that this Criollo man was not walking this earth as a mixed race subject, nor was he embracing the other two races that supposedly constituted our national identity. Picot walked this earth as a white man, carrying with him all the privileges that identity entailed, including the capacity to mobilize the violence of the state and its institutions to preserve his whiteness and worldview. One of the few photos of Picot at El Fanguito is here reproduced in the right, where Picot, alongside the police and other officials, surveyed the landscape to ensure compliance with zoning regulations. What does it mean for a man who walked this earth embodying whiteness to literally walk through this black space? Did he see those around as fellow humans, as not yet humans, as soon to be humans, or as impossible humans? How does it feel to know that you can ghost entire communities? How does it feel to know that you have the power to eliminate them from the landscape? How does it feel to deny the possibility of humanness to others? These questions seek to haunt the memory of Rafael Picot and the neat stories of progress, development, and modernization that he and his contemporaries wanted to tell about Puerto Rico. What if we haunt the archives of Puerto Ricanidad with black ghosts, indigenous ghosts, wayward ghosts, queer ghosts, abandoned ghosts, young ghosts, old ghosts, motherly ghosts, working class ghosts, barrio ghosts, or diasporic ghosts? What happens to our analytical eyes, to our critical readings, to our understandings and knowledge of histories when we invoke those spectral lives? In hunting the archive, because after all, it is up to us to do the hunting. What if in that practice we also engage in the act of refusal? Refusal to silencing race and wayward lives, refusal of the single narrative, refusal of myths of mestizaje and benevolent slavery, refusal of whiteness and collaborators with empire. In refusing to accept what the archive offers, in hunting it, we engage in a different reading practice. It is a reading of the past with the present and the future in mind. In thinking with ghosts and phantom places and their capacity to haunt, we are oriented to the past with those processes and people who disappeared them from memory and the landscape. In hunting the archive, those spectral lives, as Sarah Salem recently wrote, bring the future through the notion of what could have been. What could have been of San Juan and Puerto Rico if those ghosted communities were still with us? What other futures could they have imagined and crafted had they still be here? Those critical questions are what hunting as method and agency allow us to ask. Thank you.
Buenos dias. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. I'm really just thrilled to be here, and I also want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to everyone at CENTRO who's worked so diligently to make this event possible. Thank you so much to our truly visionary directora, Yomaira Figueroa Vasquez, to our amazing project manager, Ise Diaz, to our wonderful faculty presider, Vanessa Perez Rosario, and to organizations like the Mellon Foundation and CUNY for really supporting this transformational sort of research initiative. And in the next 10 minutes, I want to briefly present an overview of this project that I've been developing, an archival-based public digital humanities project that I'm calling the Latinx Catskills. And I would like to begin by offering you or showing you a series of New York Times articles published in 1965 and then in 1971, chronicling the experiences of the legions of Puerto Ricans and other Latinos who escaped the sweltering city summers to find cool respite in the rural rolling hills of the Catskills region. As the Times reported, on any given summer weekend, at least, quote, 5,000 Latinos would seek refuge from the teeming city streets, traveling to the wildly popular stretch of Latino-owned resorts, motels, villas, and other lodgings clustered around Route 32 and Plattle Kill in the foothills of the Catskill Mountains. Quote, Less than 2 hours ride from New York City, 75 to 100 villas or casas exude their own brand of countrified Puerto Rico by way of East Harlem, the Bronx, and Paterson, New Jersey. The area, commonly known first as the Spanish Alps and later as the Puerto Rican Alps, was, as the Times described it, the Latin counterpart to the Jewish Borscht Belt, that predominantly Jewish region of the Catskills now celebrated in academic projects, coffee table books, and shows like The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. But whereas the Jewish Catskills lives on cultural memory, the long-standing Puerto Rican and Latinx inflection in the region has received almost no scholarly attention. So this project, the Latinx Catskills, seeks to recover, to document, to analyze this important, if understudied chapter of New York Latino history. It repositions the Catskills as a generative space for Puerto Rican and Latino cultural and social life. Now, of course, it's not intuitive for most of us to think about the Catskills as a Puerto Rican space, right? Let alone a Latino space. And in fact, when we think about New York, the New York Puerto Rican experience, we almost always associate it with an urban scape, right? We are thinking about urban identities and urban identities tied to the experience of labor migration. I use that phrase labor migration because it's the title of one of the books that is so wedded to Centro's own institutional beginnings. Arguably, for too long and too often in the social sciences and the humanities and the arts, we've tended to think about New York Puerto Rican life solely, right, in relationship to these urban spaces and in relation to experiences of toil, lives almost exclusively defined by urban labor, right? I'm thinking about working, about seeking work, about the inability to work, about being overworked. As a poetic anthem of New York Puerto Rican identity, Pietri's Puerto Rican obituary so memorably puts it, they work 10 days a week and were only paid for 5. They worked, they worked, they worked. And I would go further and say and claim, right, that too often Latinx lives and Puerto Rican lives are defended in the United States, deemed valuable only in relation to questions of labor and productivity. Immigrants, we get the job done, as the Hamilton musical famously declares it. And in this sense, I'm thinking about the Latinx Catskills as opening a critical space to rethink the New York Puerto Rican experience and Latinidad, not just beyond the urban, but also beyond and across questions of work. The project centers leisure, rest, joy, experiences that long have been part of New York Puerto Rican and Latino life, but are rarely acknowledged in our archives and cultural memory. You only need to look at the happy, relaxed faces and photos, families and friends riding up in cars, charter buses, guaguas, or ferries to spend a weekend, even a day, right? They had these like giras, the buses would leave from the Bronx or places in New Jersey and go off for a day trip and come back late at night to enjoy themselves in the rustic landscape that evoked memories of the homeland and El Campo. Fresh air, swimming pools, freshwater swimming holes, sports, hiking, of course, live music, and lots of food, including roast pork lechon, a specialty of many of the resorts, made these places truly cherished spaces. As a Puerto Rican, Shorty Martinez, who was the owner of Sunny Acres Hotel, puts it, why do we have to go back to Puerto Rico when we have the island right here in the Spanish Alps? Right. Or as another owner, gleefully speaking to the New York Times reporter, said, look, they're having a good time, and that's what counts. The Latinx Catskills takes at its premise that indeed, this good time counts. And I see this good time so clearly in this family photograph of a group of Puerto Ricans in the Catskills gathered around a lechon. They're eating, they're drinking, they're smiling, they're enjoying the great outdoors in their Sunday's best. And this photo, I should mention, is courtesy of each Martinez, who is the son of the Martinez I just quoted, owner of Sunny Acres, who grew up, working and playing and enjoying himself up in the Catskills. He's also the author of a truly wonderful book on the series of Images of America called Las Villas de Plattlekill. And a lot of the images, it includes a treasure trove of images. So for those interested, I really recommend it. But this is an image to me that contrasts so sharply and so evocatively with another more familiar photo to us. Say, for example, Hiram Maristani's well-known 1971 photograph, Lechon Roasting Pig in City Alley, which is part of the Smithsonian's permanent collection. Maristani, as many of you know, was a former Young Lords member, a self-taught photographer, and later director of Museo del Barrio, as well as Centro's first artist in residence. And he took some of the most iconic and powerful images of mid and late 20th century New Rican life. And to me, it's incredibly striking to see these photos side by side. One, intimate, close, warm, of joy and leisure and communal affluence in the salutary outdoors. The other, documentary, with its panoramic, eagle-eyed view capturing the strength and survival despite destitution and hardship, resilience and community making amidst the harsh elements in what Piri Thomas famously baptized as down these mean streets. And I want to be emphatic that it's not one story is true and not the other, right? But that these are complementary, coetaneous experiences. And we've tended to document one arguably at the expense of the other. The Latinx Catskills brings together a wide array of archival materials into the digital sphere. And this is another moment in which we can contrast a really kind of iconic and famous photograph by Maristani of the kids playing sort of outdoors in the summer, and a photo from a family album in the Catskills. Again, I want to have the project open a space for us to think, right, these images, these experiences in relation to each other. So the project brings together photographs, ephemera like brochures, flyers, menus, postcards, matchbox, tickets, programs, oral histories, home recordings, letters, correspondence, articles in newspapers, business records. I'm looking at some like guest books and employee rosters, music performance, the visual arts, diaries, memoirs, literature, maps, travel guides, and even some real estate and legal documents. I've been working with some zoning deeds. And together, right, together, all these richly varied archival sources allow us to document the surprisingly long history of the Catskills as a place of Puerto Rican and Latino rest and relaxation. As the project shows, despite being little known today, the Catskills were a consistent adjunct to the Puerto Rican and Latino urban experience throughout much of the 20th century. The Puerto Rican Alps that were celebrated in the Times in the 1960s and 70s, which cater mostly to a Puerto Rican clientele, trace their roots all the way back to at least the 1920s, when Spaniards and Cubans first purchased farmland and opened seasonal lodgings, and we would have been more likely to find paella valenciana than arroz con gandules on the bill of fare. Throughout the 20th century, the number of resorts continued to grow and expand, serving Latinos of all income levels. Some had this sort of luxurious air with dance halls and casinos. Others offered more modest accommodations geared towards families and offering hearty family-style meals and shared bathrooms. And here, for example, we have an image of the very respectable Hotel Habana from the 1910s, 1920s, which was in the northest part of the Catskills region. The long durée of the Catskills, right, is also evidenced in a newspaper like La Voz from the 1930s. During the summer months, La Voz ran a two-page weekly spread that advertised all sorts of events: music, dances, political rallies, boxing matches, weddings, and so much more. The area embodied what La Voz promised to be the good life, a good time, a sentiment so well captured, right, in the advertisement from the 1930s, en la montaña goce la vida, right? And in closing, I just want to briefly telegraph how this project not only, right, and these digital methodologies that the project employs, not only allows us to map or to render visible the synchronized histories and stories of different demographic groups, of different geographies, of different temporalities, but also and outside and beyond the city and questions of labor, but also through and across fields and areas and disciplines. Along with a digital map, the project features a series of thematic tours that interpret these sites and objects variously. And this is a story about literature, right? Like the story of the Mexican author Jose Juan Tablada, who built a bungalow in the Catskills. He was famously the owner in the 1920s of La Librería de los Latinos in 1920s. It's also the story and literature of Jose Martí, who wrote Versos Sencillos, his, arguably most important poetry collection while convalescing up in the Catskills. This is also a story about diplomacy and transnational politics. A lot of, in the late 19th century, as Cubans were trying to broker their independence from Spain, a lot of well-heeled Cubans would go up to the Catskills and vacation there in order to network, right, and gain political influence. And last but not least, right, this is, of course, a story about music. So many wonderful musicians. From Los Panchos in the 1950s to the Boogaloo pioneer Pete Rodriguez, and salsa giants like El Gran Combo de Puerto Rico played in the Catskills, right? And in that song, that iconic anthem of Latino New York, right? Un Verano en Nueva York has kind of immortalized this region in the first set of chorus, right? Where it makes a direct reference to Las Villas. This song, like this project, provides a critical opening for remembering that Juan, Miguel, Milagros, Olga, Manuel, they worked, pero también gozaron. Thank you.
To begin with, I would like to thank CENTRO, who brought this event and the Rooted and Relational initiative to life. And I also want to thank all the panelists and the rest of the fellow group for not only their respective, is that better? Okay. Respective interventions today, but throughout this year, and for all the many ways in which their interdisciplinary work has helped me to better articulate my own analysis of the links between Puerto Rican objects, museum institutions, and creative practice. So my research practice is grounded in my work as a museum anthropologist and in my background in the Puerto Rican diaspora, in bringing together the histories of a discipline, the museum as an institution, and an island, tasked with the recovery, analysis, and interpretation of Puerto Rican museum collections and their itineraries to museum settings. I compare institutional case studies along varied object types and settings. So this unincorporated U.S. island territory has been collected really widely and systematically by North American museums in many varied contexts, from the 1893 Chicago's World's Fair to early 20th century scientific surveys and inter-island archaeological expeditions to even contemporary art auctions. So my talk today begins to sketch how I'm beginning to attempt to expand my personal practice of what it means to be a collections-based researcher and work in and with cultural repositories, historically, artistically, and digitally. Historical in the sense of the handling of the fragmentation of the past and repair in the present, rejoining that which has been separated by time, curatorial practice, and institutional cataloging systems. Artistic in the sense of considering Puerto Rican material history beyond that which has been collected traditionally by museum institutions, to explore how found objects might be taken up in new forms of island narratives. And digital in the sense of classroom application and how engagement through making encourages tangible understandings of material past, presents, and futures. So in other words, a call to expanding archival methodologies for me entails a broader definition of not only the types of materials to be studied, but a critical dialogue around their juxtaposition. My work began largely as a documentary project, exploring North American museum collections for any and all traces of Puerto Rican object presence. And what I recovered was often the regular and large-scale presence of Puerto Rican material culture in the storage holdings of many of the earliest and most prominent North American museums. And so I now understand my research as an act of remembering through the reconstruction of original collection acquisition contexts or the evidence narration of the what, why, and how certain objects have come to be housed in and stewarded by specific sites of cultural interpretation. Institutional case studies, I argue, represent microhistories that together comprise an understudied trajectory of Puerto Rican object relations with the U.S. mainland, resulting assemblages across national, city, and university museum settings materialize both the large-scale driving forces of history and also the often overlooked context surrounding intercultural exchange. Collections, though, don't just tell the stories of objects. Museum records grant access to the multiple intersecting gazes of the often unnamed object makers and the named museum collectors, whose object definitions have shaped historical frameworks, both in terms of its tropes and its silences. And so I see material narratives as critical explorations of the process of knowledge production and the role of archival materials in the development of our academic ways of knowing in the present. And I strive in my work to remember the intersecting work of many actors whose contributions to the acquisition and the interpretation of material culture have traditionally been or under-acknowledged. The material work of these communities exists in the archives, but they as actors do not, unless rendered fully visible as knowledge producers. And so here the close reading of museum records in this way complicates visions of institutional actors like collectors and anthropologists as solitary creators of material understandings. And for me, such orientations are really critical. In the words of Jocelyn Fenton Stitt, in the quote, stretches of our understanding of what archives might look like, including remembering lives and events not conventionally contained in traditional repositories to powerfully expand the project of Caribbean cultural preservation and representation to be one of many voices and histories that value local narrators and lived experience as valid, significant material sources. Most museum collections, however, largely exist outside of public view and access. Exhibitions then emerge as important spaces for making collections publicly visible and for showcasing the variable ways in which objects might support historical storytelling. Here are some recent images of recent exhibitions at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. A 2023 exhibit entitled 1893, U.S. Imperial Visions and Revisions at the National Portrait Gallery, curated by Taina Cargal and Kate Clark LeMay, revisited the historical context of the War of 1898 through the material lens of portraits and positioned Puerto Rico in conversation with Cuba, Hawaii, the Philippines, and Guam. This exhibit thus charted the island as part of both national and transnational historical legacies of expansion and sovereignty. In comparison, an ongoing exhibit entitled Presente, a Latino History of the United States, stands as the first gallery space of the forthcoming National Museum of the American Latino. This interim interpretive space centers community contributions to U.S. history and culture through the use of Puerto Rican material culture from domestic objects to historical photographs. So for me, museum curation as a practice continues to contend with the weight of the absences of the narratives and of the materials of those to whom the historical record has obscured or those whom academic study has previously disregarded. Beyond these frameworks of traditional exhibits, artistic practice has broadened my thinking around how I might sketch the boundaries of Puerto Rican museum collections that I analyze and the very physical space of the archive. My first experience of Pablo Delano's The Museum of the Old Colony installation was a visit to the King Juan Carlos of Spain Center at NYU, and it was only upon close looking that I noticed several key features that were unsettling an otherwise traditional exhibit format, with gold-tipped gold pins attaching materials to walls in lieu of standard frames, and red stamps on the front of images naming a fictive institution, the Museum of the Old Colony. With the juxtaposition of appropriated images and found objects, his material confrontation of the past not only made visible structural power differentials and recurring harmful tropes of depiction, but also shifted the viewer's gaze back towards the museum as the central object of scrutiny. Such themed representational groupings of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans demonstrate the many ways in which asymmetrical logics and dynamics actively remain structured, taught, codified, and represented as natural and fixed, but also simultaneously how they might be documented and critically challenged across agentive networks of materials, actors, landscapes, and temporalities. Such examples of contemporary museum practice can serve, in the words of Sandra Ruiz, as a timely intervention that, quote, shifts us beyond dread and despair, reorienting subjects that are often lost in history, in portraying a past and present Puerto Rico characterized by more than repeated cycles of crisis, debt, and death. In unruly subjects, artists Natalia and Sofia recreate a storage facility, setting as an installation site, therein rendering that which is typically outside of public view to that which is centered as the object of exhibition display. And I understand their work as moving beyond a critical act of reassembling acquisition histories of Puerto Rican museum collections within the parameters of traditional research. And instead of imagining a fictive museum here, They're provoking questions of contemporary repair within the Smithsonian institution through creative forms of audiovisual display that entangle the work and understandings of Puerto Rican scholars and artists to activate existing collections. One of the agendas of Caribbean studies, according to anthropologist Deborah Thomas, is to create counter archives that offer new possibilities for seeing connections previously unexamined. When I first learned about caring for objects as a museum anthropologist, I was trained in close looking, working with archival records, appreciating converging histories of disciplines and institutions. But over time, my research field sites have expanded beyond storage facilities to include historical exhibitions and art installations. And the continued transformation of collected Puerto Rican objects from digital formats to 3D models to object replicas has brought me to consider the words of Heidi Gleichmar in terms of how we might trace, quote, how knowledge is built up from objects, what interpretive frames we use, and the ways in which they bring particular views of the object into being. In other words, how does the work of digitizing, whether by scholars like archaeologist Isabel Rivera-Colasso, with her project Descendants United for Nature, Adaptation, and Sustainability, or entities like the Smithsonian Institution's Digitization Program Office, impact our understandings of historical objects and the possibilities of representation? For me as a museum anthropologist, reckoning with material past for more just futures necessitates then reckoning not only with how exhibit displays are narrated and structured, but with the broader implications of how power is entangled in histories of collecting, and of the collective agency possible through to-be-charted futures of creative practice, digitization, and material learning. Bound up in the changing research practice is an evaluation of how I might teach and use classrooms as a site of evaluation to consider our individual commitments to acknowledge our roles as not only stewards of the past, but makers of material and increasingly digital ecosystems. And so I'll end my talk here with a question rather than answer. By and for whom are public institutions like museums, and what are our individual roles in this current moment? Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you to the panelists for these wonderful, provocative interventions. As I was listening to you and I was thinking about your work, I thought about how all of you in different ways are thinking about the limits of the archives of Puerto Rican studies, what has been left out of the archives, which voices are excluded, which objects have not been collected or exhibited, which experiences are not written about, which geographies have been erased, and how do we address these silences, gaps, and limits of the archive? Do you address them theoretically? Some of you are proposing theoretical ways of addressing these limitations. Do you develop new methodologies for addressing them? Some of you mentioned in your presentation the work of some theorists and thinkers, people who you are thinking with. One of my questions for all of you is how do we, I think you're all thinking about how do we read the past, and I'd love to hear you all talk a little bit about how do we read the past, but also why do we read the past, and what kind of an impact does the past have on our futures? To Amanda's question. So I'm going to start out with that question, and to give people in the audience an opportunity to think of their questions, and you are welcome to line up here, and I'll ask the panelists to respond to that question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So I don't know, anyone want to think about how do we read the past? Why do we read the past? And what kind of relevance does it still have for our present and our futures? Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot recently about the ways that we relate to the people who we meet through the archives, right? And pushing myself to, and sometimes there are things that really tug at my ear when I'm reading a document. For example, as you heard in my presentation, right, I became a parent recently, right, about 2 years ago. And so now that opens up whole new dimensions of the ways that I'm reading these documents, of the things that I'm thinking about, right? Where do we see families and these connections that folks are caring for, even amidst these really horrible conditions, right? And the same document that you read in 1 year, you might go back to several years later with new life experiences that then inform the way that you read them, right? And so some of the things that have come from that are, I focus on emancipation, and after slavery ended, essentially for 3 years, formerly enslaved people were forced to work under contract, right? And I found documents in Caguas that show that several parents, right, hired their own children, right? And this was a way for them to comply with what the state required of them, but also said, essentially, right, you're my baby, you're gonna live in my house, right? And sure, you need to work officially, right? You will work in my house, right? And so seeing this not as a, wow, how cruel of this parent to say you need to work and I'm your employer, right? But thinking about it as a form of protecting their children from the surveillance, right, and the intervention of the state. And so these are ways that I try to think about how we relate to these people, right, and not allow our temporal distance from them to flatten the number of dimensions that can impact their lives and what we can know about them, right? So why we read the past, this is so that we can start to answer, or at least pose the questions to get people thinking about the things that were not included in the creation of those sources, right? There's so many times I want to grab the person who wrote the letter and be like, the question was right there. What do you think about this? Right? And they didn't, right? And so now we have to play this guesswork, right? And it's hard, right? But it's not impossible for us to get closer to, right? We can't know everything. I said this at some point this year, right? My impulse at first was, I want to know everything, right? And everything's not possible, right? But we can know more than we know, and that's the work, right? Like that's how we can impact this, so that in 10 years when somebody else has these questions, that there's an article, right, that this person wrote or that person wrote, there's a book that actually starts this question that they can move the ball rolling forward on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel.
Okay. Everyone looked at me. Yeah, I've thought a lot about this question, and I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak of why I'm reading the past, and sort of the main motivation for me was the present. Like, I want to know how we ended up in this mess. And so it's a preoccupation that I have, and for me, it's being unsatisfied with narratives that are out there trying to explain, in my case, like the multiple crises that Puerto Rico is facing. I want to understand how we got there, because I am worried and really, truly, genuinely motivated by creating other futures that are not crafted by those in power, by Washington, and so forth, right? So I think there's an urgency, in a way, to look at the past, because what we know is not enough, like, as Daniel was saying, that we could know more, because there's traces in the past that can give us guides to what lies ahead. And so also the fact that we don't have all the answers, but some of the answers about how we move forward are already in the past. People, communities of maroon communities in remote communities in the mountains, and so forth, have created and imagined other futures for Puerto Rico. They're not documented fully in those archives, but maybe there are traces there that can point to better futures, right? So for me, it's the present and the future is always sort of part of it's present in the archive as I'm reading it as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I would just add briefly, this is a rather kind of inchoate thought, but such a generative question. And I would say that something that strikes me and was very present while listening to all these amazing panelists is the fact that how much my thinking about archives has changed over the past year or so. I used to think about archives or approach archives as a space where one went to look for objects that we didn't know existed, or the hidden, or the thing that nobody has read or seen. And more I'm thinking about archives as a space that helps us facilitate connections so that we can see what's in plain sight. And by that, I mean, something like the history of Las Villas is not unknown to the degree that it's mentioned in the opening verse of the most, iconic New York song, Un Verano en Nueva York, right? But it's sort of like the questions, right? The archive eliciting new questions, new approaches, new ways of looking, right, to what's there that kind of reveals what's in plain sight. I'm also just so touched and inspired by, say, Daniel's work, the difference in approaching the slave versus the enslaved person, the difference between approaching slavery versus the institution of slavery, right? And thinking about the slave as the enslaved person, as a person, as a human. That, it's not that we're revealing something new, but that the approaches, right, the types of questions that these archives facilitate allow us to see something that was always there, but somehow remain invisible to our gaze, to our critical gaze.
Thank you.
Just to echo everyone, I think one of the things I was attempting to emphasize in my talk was the ways in which I was taught. So when I'm a museum anthropologist, and my training is in archaeology. And when I was taught about care, and I was taught about sort of thinking with the archives, I was taught to really think about caring for objects. And there's this whole sort of canon of best practices of like how you hold objects both hands, have a plan where you're going to set it down. And I think over the course of my work, working with Puerto Rican museum collections, I've come to really think about how I can care not just for objects, but sort of expand that notion of care to caring for relationships, to caring for, communities of people. The work of sort of museum anthropology, the work of collections, or work in the archive is often a very solitary sort of experience. And so thinking through how you can bring other peoples and experiences into the work. And also for me, thinking about that I was not the only one sort of working with museum collections. There was this whole host of Puerto Rican contemporary artists who were doing these really profound and thoughtful interventions in museums, or evoking sort of fictive museum spaces, and that I should be in dialogue with these folks in the same way that I should be in dialogue with folks who were recreating museum collections in digital forms to understand the implications of creating objects in sort of new formats, and what does that mean, and what are the ethics of that?
Wonderful. Thank you all. Do we have a question? Wonderful. Okay, we have at least one question.
Hi, good morning. My name is Ari. I'm joining from, I don't know if anyone has heard of my org. It's called JUPI. It's Juventud Unida por la Independencia. We're a grassroots org here in New York. But I saw y'all were having this event, so I had to come through. So my question is for Daniel. So currently in Dorado, we are seeing an influx of rich expats and and Act 60 beneficiaries developing the land to build houses, homes, neighborhoods, and businesses that are financially and culturally excluding Puerto Ricans as well as Dominican and Haitian immigrants, while also utilizing their labor at exponentially low rates. So my question for you is, are we seeing history repeat certain facets of slavery in a way that has been legalized in Puerto Rico and in the same areas these institutions were held before?
That's a good question. Some of the underlying logics of slavery, right? That like people could be utilized in the same way that you would utilize a tool or an animal, right? Never went away, right? The logics of being able to also use somebody until they were no longer usable, right? Like this is a tenet of capitalism, right? And so like capitalism as one of the great evils of the world, right? It didn't end with abolition, right? And in fact, wherever abolition ended slavery, de jure slavery, right? There were folks who had machinations on how do we continue to exploit labor, particularly of Black people, right? And so are we seeing history repeat itself? I mean, I don't know. Then we could get into questions of like, where does the loop end and restart, right? Like, it could just still be the same thing, right? And also, we need to recognize that slavery, right, that we see, that I work with in the archives, right, was legally and socially constructed and was, I mean, folks call it the particular institution, right? And so extreme and, as my other work this year is focused on, right, disabling exploitation through labor, right, of Black peoples, right, has continued, right? And this is, I think, another iteration of it, right? Like colonialism, slavery, capitalism, right? Like these are the triple dragons of the hell we've created for ourselves on this earth, right? And so I don't know if that fully answers it, but I think that there's some generative like threads to be pulled there.
Thank you. I think, yeah, another question?
Yes, thank you all very much. These are fascinating projects and look forward to the outcomes. I had a question specifically for Cristina. It's amazing work on the camping, the countryside. So I grew up in Latino Pentecostal churches, and in the 1970s, my denomination, that I grew up in, Asamblea de Dios, bought a camp up in that area. I'm not sure, and it was from former Jewish owners, is the narrative we were told. It's called Campo Mahanaim, the Camp of God. It had this interesting name, and it was controversial because it took the conventions and the retreats away from the city and up into the countryside. Some people didn't like that. So I'm curious, to make a long question shorter, if you ran across any of the religious avenues of taking folk from the city up into the countryside for retiros and things like that. Thank you.
What a wonderful comment, and I would love to talk and connect and learn a little bit more about your experiences up there. I will say that this is one of the things that's most exciting about this project for me, and why I'm so grateful for Centro's support to develop this project, is that this is living memory. It's living history. So the people that vacation and spend time in the summers and went up there for one reason or another are still living. And they can share their memories, their impressions, and I just think it's so important to gather those and tell a multifaceted story. I have encountered certain religious groups. There were also like labor organizations. So like even the Communist Party had summer schools that they would like have up there, and summer camps that they would fund. So it's interesting. There's, all the way from the left, the Communist Party sending people up, and I have seen religious organizations. Mostly, I haven't, to be honest, encountered Pentecostals, but Baptists. The Baptist Church with ties in East Harlem had a facility for 2 weeks where they would give, and this is part of their youth development programming, right? How to offer inner city kids an opportunity to sort of explore the outdoors. So there's a world, right, of stories to collect, to gather, to think about, and to put together. So I would love to talk further. Thank you so much.
My question's for Dr. Villanueva. There is an obsession with slum clearance in the 20th century in Puerto Rico, right? And obviously into the 1930s, into the 50s, that craze of slum clearance ended up becoming the phenomenon that is tourism in Puerto Rico, right? So my question is, how does tourism and like all of that discourse regarding slum clearance, like how did that impact the archives?
Thanks for that question. Yes, definitely. So there is ample documentation in Rafael Pico's archives and his published work, where he very clearly ties the fact that these slums were sort of a visual obstacle to potential tourists in Puerto Rico. So this was a time where the planning board and the government of Puerto Rico were constructing the El Caribe Hilton Hotel, and they were creating the landscape for tourism that we now have seen sort of explode exponentially. This was part of that. And so what's fascinating about the slum clearance program is that their intention really was to clear every slum in Puerto Rico. When you go to Puerto Rico, you notice that they failed. And that's the beauty of it. They failed. Some of them were disappeared, like El Fanguito, because this was like centrally located in an area where tourists might potentially see it. But if you go to Puerto Rico, in every major city, you still see these communities that persisted and prevailed despite the efforts, right? And so there is this tension between Puerto Rico's sort of desire to sell Puerto Rico as a tourist destination, but also the failure of the government to fully sort of disappear these sites from the landscape because there were so many, right? There were so many. So there's this tension between, and we see it today, between what Puerto Ricans need and desire, like fair housing, access to electricity, to water, to basic infrastructures, and also this urge from the Puerto Rican government to portray Puerto Rico as this tourist destination, right? And so development was mostly concentrated to develop the gaze of the tourist, but Puerto Ricans, some of them fell victims to this project of displacement, and some of them were actually able to avoid that fate, right? So it is very present. It is part of the project and the machinations of the elite at the time. Thanks.
Wonderful. So we have come to the end of our first panel.